We build everything here from Superbirds, original stuff, and then we got one section of our business up here just modifies new cars.
In a small town in North Carolina called Level Cross, population barely enough to fill a school gymnasium, there is a stretch of land that most people driving by would never look at twice. A few low buildings, a gravel lot, a sign for a custom car shop. Nothing that screams history. But behind those buildings, stacked on top of each other in the open air, sits somewhere between 15 and 20 race cars that have not moved in decades. Not restored, not displayed, not even fully covered from the weather. They belong to a man named Richard Petty, and for most of his life he did not think they were worth saving at all. That single fact, that the most successful driver in NASCAR history let pieces of his own legend rot behind his garage because nobody, including him, thought they would ever matter, is the strangest and most human detail in the entire Richard Petty story. This is not a tale about a hidden vault of secrets. It is something better. It is the true, documented story of a man who built the biggest career in the history of his sport, treated most of the physical evidence of it as scrap for most of his life, and only later understood what he had lost. Before any of this makes sense, you need the scale of what Richard Petty actually did, because without it, a pile of old cars behind a garage is just junk. With it, that same pile becomes one of the strangest acts of accidental self-erasure in American sports history. 200. That is how many NASCAR Cup Series races Richard Petty won across a career that ran from 1958 to 1992. The next name on that list, David Pearson, has 105. Petty does not lead the sport's all-time win list. He is nearly lapping it. Add 7 Cup Series championships, tied for the most ever. 7 Daytona 500 wins, still the record. 123 career pole positions, also a record. 513 consecutive race starts between 1971 and 1989, a streak that has never been approached. Over 1,180 career starts across 35 years behind the wheel. These numbers are not close to being broken. They're not really treated as targets anymore by anyone in the modern sport. They function more like a geological feature, something that exists, that everyone acknowledges, and that nobody expects to see moved. The operation behind those numbers was a family business, plain and simple. Petty Enterprises was founded in Level Cross in 1949 by Lee Petty, Richard's father, who won 3 championships of his own before handing the wheel of the family's most famous car, the number 43, to his son. Richard's brother Maurice built the engines. Their cousin Dale Inman ran the pit box as crew chief for most of Richard's career. For members of one family, from one small town, all of them eventually inducted into the NASCAR Hall of Fame. That compound in Level Cross is still standing today, and it is still where the Petty family works. Here is the part of the story that surprises people the most. Richard Petty has said, plainly and on the record, that he never gave much thought to preserving his old race cars while he was actually racing them. In the 1960s and 1970s, a used race car was not a piece of history. It was an asset a small team desperately needed to turn into cash, so it could build the next one. So the cars got sold. Petty has talked about selling former race cars to West Coast short-track racers for whatever price he could get, simply to keep the operation funded for the next season. The ones that did not sell, the ones too worn out or too complicated to move, did not get scrapped either. They just got pushed into a field behind the garage and left there, one on top of another, season after season, decade after decade. Petty has estimated the number at 15 to 20 cars, sitting exposed to North Carolina weather with no plan and no protection. In interviews years later, reflecting on it, he said something close to this. Nobody at the time imagined a beaten-up stock car could someday be worth hundreds of thousands of dollars, so nobody thought about trying to save them. It is a strikingly unsentimental explanation from a man who is, by every account, deeply sentimental about the sport itself. It also happens to be true of an entire era of American racing. Teams across NASCAR did the same thing, which is part of why so much of the sport's earliest hardware simply does not exist anymore. What makes Petty's version of this story different is scale. He did not lose 1 or 2 cars to indifference. He may have lost a piece of nearly every era of his career, sitting in a pile that nobody has ever fully inventoried in public. Not everything from Petty's career met that fate. 2 vehicles connected to him tell the story from opposite ends of his life, and both live within reach of that same compound in Level Cross. The first is the 1970 Plymouth Superbird, one of the most recognizable race cars ever built. Chrysler's engineers designed the Superbird's exaggerated nose cone and towering rear wing for one purpose only: reducing drag and increasing downforce at the speeds NASCAR's superspeedways demanded. It was not styling. It was aerodynamics, applied without any concern for how strange the car looked sitting still. Petty drove Plymouth products to 18 wins during the 1970 season, and the Superbird became permanently linked to his number 43 in a way almost no other car in his career matched. Examples connected to Petty's team have shown up at major auctions. A 1970 Superbird and a 1971 Roadrunner both crossed the block at a Mecum sale with Petty himself in attendance, cars that had been restored specifically for that purpose by Petty's garage. The second car is much less glamorous and in a lot of ways more important. It is the hand-built 1957 Oldsmobile that Lee Petty and his sons constructed themselves in the family garage in Level Cross, the car in which Richard Petty made his NASCAR debut. There is nothing polished about it. It represents the exact opposite moment from the Superbird. Not the peak of what Petty became, but the very beginning, when a 20-year-old from a town most people have never heard of first found out what he could do behind a wheel. Between those two cars sits the whole arc of the story that NASCAR record books can only describe in numbers. It is worth being clear about a distinction that matters here, because it is easy to blur two very different things into one mythical secret collection. There is a real, public, well-documented Richard Petty Museum. Petty's late wife, Linda, established it in 1988 at the Level Cross compound. It moved to nearby Randleman in 2003 when Petty Enterprises needed the space, and then moved back to Level Cross in March of 2014. It is open to visitors. It houses championship cars, trophies, uniforms, and family memorabilia, including personal items like Linda's doll collection and a wall of Petty's belt buckles. And by every visitor account, Richard Petty himself is frequently there in person, greeting fans with a warmth that seems to genuinely surprise people who expect a distant legend and instead get a man in a cowboy hat happy to talk for 20 minutes about a car on display. That museum is the version of the Petty legacy the world was invited to see. The pile of buried cars behind the garage is not part of that invitation. It was never curated, never protected, and by Petty's own account, never even thought about as something worth curating until it was already too late to matter for most of what sat in it. That gap between what got polished for the public and what simply got left outside is the real story here. It is not a man hoarding secrets. It is a man who spent 35 years focused entirely on winning the next race, and only decades later had time to look backward and realize what indifference had cost him. In 2008, as NASCAR grew more expensive and more corporate, and the family-run model that built Petty Enterprises became harder to sustain, Richard Petty rebranded the operation. Petty Enterprises became Petty's Garage, shifting its focus from fielding a competitive cup team to custom builds, restorations, and performance work for everyday car enthusiasts who want a piece of the Petty name on their own vehicle. The shop has built limited-edition Ford Mustangs with over 700 horsepower, custom Dodge Challengers styled after the Superbird, and even modified off-road vehicles. One of the shop's most meaningful projects in recent years was recreating the 1964 Plymouth Belvedere, the exact car Petty Enterprises fielded during Richard's first championship season. The original no longer exists in drivable form, so Petty's Garage built a period-correct recreation from the ground up, sourcing a donor chassis and working from original specifications. The project was overseen not just by Richard Petty but by his brother Maurice, the engine builder, and his cousin Dale Inman, the crew chief, 3 Hall of Fame members, all well into their 80s, standing in the same building where the original car had been built 60 years earlier, doing the same work with the same attention they'd always brought to it. It was not treated as a nostalgia exercise by anyone involved. It was simply craft, done the way it had always been done, by the people who still remembered exactly how. That project says something important about how the Petty family actually relates to its own history. Not through sealed-off shrines, but through hands-on work passed down and repeated generation after generation in the same buildings where it started. No honest account of the Petty family's relationship to legacy can skip past May of 2000. Adam Petty, Richard's grandson and Kyle Petty's son, was killed during a practice session at New Hampshire Motor Speedway when his throttle stuck and his car struck the outside wall at speed. He was 20 years old, already racing at NASCAR's national level, and by that point the fourth consecutive generation of Pettys to compete professionally in the sport, a lineage unmatched by any family in American motorsports, and one of the only four-generation professional athlete lineages in any American sport at all. Kyle Petty has spoken publicly many times over the years about how losing his son reshaped his understanding of what the family's history was actually worth protecting and what it was not. Richard Petty, a man known across 5 decades of interviews for an almost bottomless well of patience and good humor with fans and reporters alike, has spoken about Adam's death far more sparingly, in the careful, economical way of someone choosing words because none of them feel sufficient. The Adam Petty Foundation, established afterward, has worked for over 2 decades on youth health and safety initiatives, a very public, very deliberate way of turning grief into something that keeps helping people, which tracks with everything else known about how this family tends to handle pain. It is not hard to understand why a family that has lived through that kind of loss might feel differently about turning every remaining physical fragment of its history into content for public consumption. Some things get preserved for an audience. Other things get kept simply because letting go of them is not something anyone in that family has ever been willing to do. Richard Petty is in his late 80s now. He still appears at the Level Cross compound regularly. He still wears the cowboy hat and dark sunglasses that became, over 4 decades, part of the visual shorthand of American motorsport itself. Recognizable enough that Pixar built an entire animated character, Strip the King, Weathers in the Cars films, as a direct tribute to him, with Petty voicing the role himself. He still signs autographs for fans who make the drive to a town most GPS systems barely register, and by consistent, repeated account from people who have actually met him there, he is exactly what he appears to be on camera. Warm, unhurried, and genuinely interested in the person standing in front of him. What sits behind that garage? The pile of unrestored, unprotected race cars, weathered by decades of exposure and neglect that nobody, including Petty himself, ever planned or defended, is not a mystery vault built to tease collectors. It is the accidental byproduct of a man who spent 35 years racing every single week, rebuilding cars into new cars because that was what kept the operation alive, and never once treating his own past as something that needed protecting until protecting it was no longer fully possible. That is, in its own way, a more honest story than any hidden room legend could be. Richard Petty did not set out to build a monument. He set out to win races week after week for longer than almost anyone in the history of his sport, and the wreckage of that effort, some of it lovingly preserved in a museum his wife built, some of it simply left outside because nobody had time to think about it, tells you more about what that pursuit actually cost him than any polished exhibit ever could. If Richard Petty's garage in Level Cross ever gets a full, honest accounting, not a legend, not a rumor, but an actual inventory of what 15 or 20 forgotten race cars have survived sitting outside for half a century, it will not reveal secrets. It will reveal exactly what it looks like when the greatest career in the history of a sport gets built by someone who was always too busy racing to look back.